handed a bag of promotional badges for Fortunately Milk, which are probably the silliest things ever to come out of the mighty publishing empire of HarperCollins. We were trying to figure out how you can promote a book like Fortunately the Milk, about which you guys know very little, but we'll know a lot pretty soon. So they all say on them, the most exciting adventure ever written about milk since. And this one says, The Catcher in the Milk. Catcher in the Milk badge. Brave New Milk. Sorry. Les Milk. I'm gonna take somebody's eye out. This is not. Charlie and the Chocolate Milk. Westwood Milk. The milk also rises. Farewell to milk. A tale of two milkmen. Missed. Sorry. Got it. I mean, somebody got it. The remains of the milk. So, I'm going to stop flinging milk badges now. There are more. And we may actually wind up giving them to people whose questions get selected, because lots of you have written questions. And so, it's kind of weird, because this year I have 2 accidental books coming out. Probably, there isn't really a writing sort of author lessons 101, but if there was, there'll be a list of do's and don'ts on it, and it will be a really good list of do's and don'ts, because it would, I know that in the don't column, don't have a major novel for adults coming out in June, followed by a book for kids in September, would be high on the list of don'ts. And it all happened a bit accidentally. Fortunately, the milk was... Fortunately, the milk began because I felt guilty about dads. Approximately 25 years ago, I was telling my son, Michael, who at that point would have been about 4, to do something, the kind of thing you tell kids to do, like go to bed. He looked up at me furiously and he said, I wish I didn't have a dad. He said, I wish I had. And then he gets him trying to figure out, well, what else could you have? And he said, I wish I had goldfish. And he went off to bed, and I'm just going, that's brilliant. And so I went and wrote the first sentence of the day I swapped my dad for 2 goldfish. And it just sat there for about 4 years, until one day I was completely stuck on something else. And I was just looking at files that didn't really contain very much, looking for some kind of idea, and there's the first paragraph of the day I swapped my dad for 2 goldfish. And I went, I know what happens next. So I wrote it. And that technically was my first children's book. And I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's about a kid whose dad is sitting reading the paper, which is kind of dull. And he trades his dad for 2 goldfish owned by the kid next door, and then his mum comes back, and she's like, where's your father? And he's like, look at my goldfish. Aren't they great? And she's like, okay, you take the goldfish and don't come back without your dad. And he goes to the kid who
Thank you.
owned the goldfish. The kid's like, yeah, well, he was kind of dull. He didn't do anything. He just read the paper, so I traded him for this electric guitar. So it's a story about this kid going all over town, getting his dad back. And finally, he finds him sitting in a rabbit run, sadly eating a carrot and reading his newspaper. And the book came out, and it's been very popular and very well loved, and it gets given to dads. And I felt really guilty about this. And slowly, as time goes on, you know, sort of going, I need to do something that dads could be proud of. So I decided to write a book that was a dad kind of story. And it's one of these dads who and it just started out with him going out to get the milk for his children's cereal. And he's a little bit late coming back. And when his children ask him what happened, he tells them everything that happened, trying to get the milk back, beginning, obviously, with him being kidnapped by aliens who want to remodel the planet and, you know, replace the mountains with throw cushions, etc. Australia will be replaced by a huge decorative plate with Australia on it. Terrible taste. And then, you know, he escapes from them and is captured by pirates, and then he's rescued by a time-traveling stegosaurus in a hot air balloon. After that, things start getting weird. And it was a thing in my notebook that I was writing just every time I felt like cheering myself up. I would go and I would write a little bit of Fortune of the Milk, and it probably took about a year to write. And I'd just write a scene and make myself laugh and then put it away and come back to it. And then eventually I looked at it and I went, well, it's a book. It wasn't meant to be a book. It's just meant to be a sort of little picture book, but it just kept going. So I handed that over to a slightly bemused editor. Very pleased. But on Twitter, there's a wonderful artist named Scotty Young, who a few of you may be familiar with. He's a fantastic artist. And at some point on Twitter, somebody had said to him, I wish you'd do something with Neil. And he'd written back and said, oh, I would love to work with Neil. And I dropped him a direct line. I said, would you? And he said, oh yeah. So Scotty got to illustrate Fortune of the Milk, which is really fun. If you want somebody to draw a time-traveling stegosaurus in a hot air balloon, Scotty Young is your man. It may happen to some of you. So that was one of my accidental books. The other is much darker. And it's called The Ocean at the End of the Lane. The Ocean at the End of the Lane began in a lot of different ways for me. I could tell the very sort of simple story of why there is an unexpected Neil Gaiman novel coming out right now, which is that I started writing a short story. And after a while, I looked around and I decided I was writing a novelette. I checked the word count on Wikipedia of what makes a short story and what makes a novelette. It's a novelette, that's good. And then I kept writing it. And then I decided, obviously, I knew that I must have gone past novelette somewhere in there, so now it was a novella. And then, a novella is long, you know, you can go from 18,000 words to 40-something thousand words, you're still a novella. So, sent off an email at some point in there to my wonderful editor, Jennifer, who came up and introduced me, and said, novella, not really sure what we're going to do with it, but it seems to be happening. And then I got to the end, and I did a word, I'd been writing it all in longhand, which is how I like to write. So I got to the end, and I typed it all up, and then I did a word count. And then I sent Jen a rather awkward little note saying, I appear to have written a novel. I hope you don't mind. And she didn't. So that's the objective story about how the book was written, which says absolutely nothing about what went on inside my head or what kind of book it is. And it's a very peculiar, very, very dark little book. And I think it's funny that I've got 2 books coming out within a few months of each other. One's a children's book with an adult narrator that is probably the funniest, silliest thing I've ever done. And then one's an adult book with a 7-year-old viewpoint character. It's being told by an adult who, at the end of the prologue, seems to remember things about being 7 that he'd forgotten for a long time. And now they're coming back. And it began for me in about 2003. And I bought a Mini. And I was very proud of my Mini. And my dad, who I didn't see very much because he was in England, came over to America. And I said, look, Mini. And he said, yeah, nice cars. Not much like the one that we used to drive, that I had in the early 60s. And I said, oh my gosh, your white Mini. I'd forgotten about that. Why didn't you get rid of it? It was such a great little car. And he said, you mean I never told you? And I said, no. And he said, well, he said, we had a lodger and came over from South Africa with a bunch of money that he'd been given by other South Africans, because you couldn't take money out of South Africa those days. A lot of his friends had given him money and he'd smuggle it out. He was meant to be banking it in England for them. And instead, he went to Brighton, to the casino. And he spent all his own money. And then he only planned to dip into their money until he'd won what he'd lost back. And then he lost everything. He came back from Brighton. In the small hours of the morning, he stole the Mini, took it down to the end of the lane, and committed suicide in it. And I thought, that happened. My car. My lane. And I was 7. And I was reading books, and I never knew things like that happened. Nobody told me. And that was sort of the beginning point. I just thought that I didn't know anything more about this guy. I didn't really... But that event, or that idea of that event, because it's not really about the real person, sat in my head like that weird little grains of sand that eventually produced pearls, and it irritated me. And at the same time, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, somebody told me that one of the farms down the lane, at the end of the lane that I lived on, had been in the Doomsday Book, which is the book that William the Conqueror ordered compiled of everything in England, all of the properties in England when he conquered. And I thought, that means it's 1,000 years old. And it didn't occur to me that the farm would not have looked like that 1,000 years ago. In my head, this big old red brick farm had obviously just been there for 1,000 years. And I thought, I wonder if the people who are there have been there for 1,000 years. So, and that became a kind of weird little thing in my head, and I would play with it. And I'd play with it when I was in my teens. somewhere in my early teens, they became called the Hempstocks. I'm not quite sure why. And I always meant to write about them. And never quite did. So I put some Hempstocks into Stardust, just to show that I was going to. And then when I was writing the Graveyard book, Liza Hempstock is in there. And she's obviously related to the Hempstock family, Daisy Hempstock. And people occasionally would say, you know, you've got the Hempstocks in Stardust and Liza Hempstock in the Graveyard book. Are they related? I'd say, well, yeah, kind of. But one day, but the problem with writing a story about the Hempstocks is they lived at the end of my lane. And suddenly one day, I thought, well, if I'm going to do a short story, I should just do a little short story about that. And I started this short story. And really, it was written because I missed my wife. She was in Melbourne making an album, and she was going to be there for 4 months. And I thought, well, I'll write her a little story that's not actually about my family, not really about the stuff that happened, but that's very much about what it was to see the world through my eyes when I was 7. And also about the landscape that I grew up in, because that landscape simply isn't there anymore. Now it's turned into giant housing estates, all of these strange empty places where we used to go. So it really was, that was where it began. And the process of writing it was one that got very, very dark, very peculiar. I've heard people point to writing and say it can be like driving at night. And writing this for me wasn't just like driving at night. This was like driving at night with one headlight out in thick fog. You can just see far enough ahead to not drive off the road. So you kind of keep going. When I would finish writing for the day, I would have a pretty good idea of what I would be writing tomorrow. I would have no idea of what was happening in the story the day after that. Which means the things that happen are very, very organic. And it became a story, I guess, about stories, which will come as no surprise at all to anybody who's ever read anything by me ever. But it's probably a lot less intellectual than a lot of my stuff. It's very much about what it is to take refuge in books, the relationship between people and fiction. I'm fascinated by writing. It's pretty weird when you've written a book and it hasn't quite come out, but people have read it because there are review copies floating around, and then early reviews start coming out. You're reading it and go, it's interesting. Is it that? There seems to be a school of thought coming out of the UK that it is not actually a fantasy novel at all. That it is absolutely mainstream and deals with the dangers of memory. And I'm going, perfectly interesting, valid point of view. Not one I had when I wrote it. But all power to you. So those are the 2 main books that I've got coming out. That's sort of what they are. And that has nothing at all to do with why fiction is dangerous. Which is the kind of topic that you come up with when somebody says, well, you're going to be doing a discussion at BookExpo on the Saturday morning. What would you like the topic of your discussion to be? And you say, well, why fiction is dangerous. Figuring it's 6 weeks away, I'll come up with something. And it's actually really only about a week ago that I said to them, so this discussion. They said, yes. I said, who am I going to be in discussion with? They said, you'll just be talking. I said, that's not a discussion. That is a monologue. Discussion is the one where somebody else comes up and they do all the work by saying, so Neil, tell us about your book. There you go. Good question. I know why non-fiction is dangerous. Non-fiction is dangerous because when you're about 8 years old, you find a lot of books entering your life with titles like 1001 Exciting Things a Boy Can Do. And then you do them. And you reap the consequences. For example, did you know that using only the common beetroot, the beet, you can dye your father's white shirts a deep purpley red? He will not like this, but you can. But it said in the book, take a white shirt. I don't have any white shirts. Did not appreciate this. And then there was toffee making. And toffee making was great. You got a recipe for making toffee. And I did it. And you heated up the sugar, the water and the butter and the syrup, and you got it very, very hot, and then you got a glass, and you dripped everything in, and eventually it got hard, and you went, yes, this thing is now hard. I have now a lump of toffee the size of a softball, which I will put in my pocket and take to school. Somewhere in the late afternoon, you will reach into your pocket for a handkerchief, which is in your pocket, and you will pull out the handkerchief, and a softball-sized, golden, amber-like lump of toffee is going to do a beautiful arc into the air. And you will discover the physical properties of toffee are really interesting, because if you've made it right, when it hits the ground, it will shatter like glass and completely cover the floor of the classroom with tiny glass-like toffee shards. And you will find yourself absolutely unable to convince your maths teacher this is not something you would do on purpose. Despite the fact that you're going, why would I want to do this? This is my toffee. Of course but you will spend the rest of the lesson cleaning up, picking up tiny glass-like shards of toffee. And then you'll be given a note. You will take it to your headmaster, who will take his pipe out of his mouth and say, well, I know that it's sort of a cliche to say this will hurt me more than it will hurt you, but actually it's going to hurt you a lot more than it's going to hurt me. We'll take out a large sneaker and hit you with it. So that is why non-fiction is dangerous. Fiction is dangerous, of course, because it lets you into other people's heads. Fiction is dangerous because it gives you empathy. Fiction is dangerous because it shows you that the world doesn't have to be like the one that you live in, which is an incredibly dangerous thing for the world. I was in China in 2007 for a science fiction convention, and it was the first officially recognized science fiction convention in China, and the Communist Party had agreed, and they brought in a bunch of us, Michael Swanwick, me, a whole bunch of American and me authors. And we went to Chengdu, and there were lots and lots of panels where we're talking to young writers. And at one point, I took one of the party officials aside, and I said, look, while not actually illegal, science fiction has been very much frowned upon and regarded as dangerous and subversive for a very long time in China. Regarded chiefly as subversive because they were never quite sure if they were being criticized. Because you can say things and in science fiction. Nobody's quite sure, are you criticizing the government or not? You're talking about some kind of evil, ant-hill-like government. Is that the government party or not? So I said, why have you said yes to this? Why have you actually got behind this? And he said, well, in China, we're really good at making things that people bring to us. They bring us iPods, iPhones, we make them. They bring us things, we go, that's great. But we don't come up with them. We don't invent. We don't innovate. And we went to America recently, and we talked to the people at Google, to the people at Apple, to the people at Microsoft. And one of the things we asked all of these people who invent, who innovate, is, what did you read as children? And they all said, we read science fiction, we read fantasy. We thought, we read this stuff and we went, the world doesn't have to be like the one we're in right now. We can change it. And that was the point they decided to encourage the reading of science fiction. And I thought that actually is the big dangerous thing. Letting people into other people's heads is dangerous, and showing them that things can be different is incredibly dangerous. Now, we have a huge stack of questions in the viewer, and I said that I would do my very best to get through as many as I could. Here, let's swap. There we go.
Okay. We have a lot of questions. We're going to do as many as we can.